Stand at the base of Hearst Castle today, that white palace gleaming against California's sky like a fever dream made marble, and ask the tour guide what stood here before William Randolph Hearst poured millions into his Enchanted Hill, and they'll tell you about camping trips, about a simple ranch, about a wealthy man's boyhood playground transformed into a monument to Gilded Age excess. But what they won't tell you, what the carefully curated narrative conveniently forgets, is that San Simeon's story didn't begin with the Hearsts at all, that long before the first stone was laid for La Cuesta Encantada, this windswept promontory overlooking the Pacific had already witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the violent displacement of peoples, the systematic erasure of cultures, the blood-soaked transformation of sacred indigenous lands into Spanish mission pastures, then into Mexican ranchos, then into American cattle kingdoms, each layer of occupation burying the previous one like geological strata, each new owner writing their own creation myth while standing on foundations built from other people's stolen dreams. The castle you see is merely the latest chapter in a book written in blood and displacement, a glittering capstone placed atop a pyramid of exploitation that stretches back 10,000 years, and if those white walls could speak, if the carefully manicured gardens and imported European antiquities could whisper their true origins, they would tell a far darker story than the official history admits. A story of the invisible hands that shaped this landscape long before the first architects' drawing was ever made, of the indigenous hunters who knew every canyon and spring, of the Franciscan priests who conscripted their labor in the name of God, of the Mexican rancheros who grazed cattle across stolen mission lands, of the American mining baron who bought an empire for a pittance during California's chaotic transition from Mexican territory to American state. Of the forgotten whaling station where men rendered whale blubber into lamp oil while the ocean ran red with blood, of the Victorian mansion that stood on these hills decades before the castle, hosting a different kind of California aristocracy with different dreams of permanence, and of the brutal truth that every layer of San Simeon's history involved someone taking something that wasn't theirs, remaking it in their own image, and calling it progress. This is the secret story of San Simeon's foundations, the tale of what came before the castle, before the Hearsts, before even the first Spanish soldier set foot on Salinan land. This is the story of the real twin estates that occupied this coast, not castles of stone but structures of power, the parallel empires of Mission and Rancho, of Mexican grant and American conquest, the overlapping territories and competing visions that transformed this stretch of California coastline from indigenous homeland into the platform upon which America's most famous palace would eventually rise, and understanding this hidden history, peeling back the layers of calculated forgetting, reveals uncomfortable truths about whose labor built California's golden age, whose land was stolen to create its legendary estates, whose stories were deliberately erased to make room for more palatable narratives of manifest destiny and entrepreneurial triumph, truths that the tour guides don't mention as they lead visitors through marble halls filled with Renaissance tapestries and Greco-Roman statuary, truths that complicate the fairy tale of the self-made millionaire building his dream house on virgin wilderness, because the wilderness was never virgin, the land was never empty, and the foundations of Hearst Castle rest not on bare California bedrock but on the accumulated weight of centuries of displacement, exploitation, and carefully orchestrated amnesia. Begin with the Salinan people, the Pleiano group who inhabited this coastal strip for at least 10 millennia before any European ever conceived of claiming it, who knew these hills and beaches not as real estate to be parceled and sold but as home, as sacred landscape, as the bones of their ancestors and the provider of their sustenance. They harvested mussels from the tide pools at what would become San Simeon Point, gathered acorns in the oak groves of what would become Camp Hill, hunted deer through the chaparral of what would become the castle's formal gardens, and their seasonal rounds took them from the coast to the interior valleys and back again in rhythms perfected over hundreds of generations, rhythms dictated not by property lines or land grants but by the natural cycles of salmon runs and acorn harvests, of summer heat and winter storms, and they left traces of their presence everywhere, shell middens marking ancient campsites, grinding stones worn smooth by generations of women processing acorns into flour through elaborate leaching processes that removed the bitter tannins, pictographs painted on cave walls in red ochre and charcoal, depicting spirits and ancestors and the sacred stories that bound their world together, and their knowledge of this landscape was encyclopedic, intimate, spanning everything from which springs ran year-round to which coastal headlands offered the best vantage points for spotting migrating whales, from which plants provided medicine for specific ailments to which times of year the acorn harvest would be abundant. And this knowledge was not written in books or recorded on maps but carried in memory, passed from generation to generation through oral tradition, through apprenticeship, through the lived experience of moving through this territory season after season, year after year, century after century, until the land itself became inseparable from Salinan identity, until every rock and tree and stream carried stories and significance that bound the people to the place in ways that Europeans, with their abstract concepts of property and ownership, could never comprehend. But when Spanish soldiers and Franciscan missionaries arrived in the late 18th century, pushing northward from their colonial bases in Baja California and central Mexico, they saw none of this culture, none of this history, none of this carefully managed landscape, because to see it would have complicated their mission, would have interfered with their divine mandate to bring Christianity and European civilization to what they characterized as empty wilderness populated by childlike savages in need of salvation, and the Spanish doctrine of terra nullius, empty land, provided legal justification for conquest, allowed them to claim that indigenous peoples had no real title to the land because they didn't cultivate it in European fashion, didn't fence it, didn't build permanent structures of stone or wood, didn't organize themselves into recognizable European-style political hierarchies. And this convenient blindness, this willful refusal to recognize sophisticated indigenous land management and complex social structures, became the founding lie upon which all subsequent layers of exploitation would be built. Mission San Miguel Arcangel, founded in 1797 about 40 miles inland from San Simeon, claimed this entire coastal region as its grazing lands, its remote pasturage where thousands of cattle and sheep could be tended by conscripted indigenous labor, and the Franciscan padres had a genius for remaking landscapes, for transforming indigenous hunting grounds into European-style agricultural estates worked by converted natives who were expected to abandon their seasonal rounds, their traditional foods, their languages and customs and spiritual practices, to live instead in mission compounds where they labored under supervision, where they died by the hundreds from European diseases against which they had no immunity, measles, smallpox, influenza, diseases that swept through mission populations with devastating speed, killing families, decimating villages, breaking the demographic backbone of indigenous California, where their children were forbidden to speak their native tongues or practice their traditional ceremonies, where the entire fabric of Salinan culture was systematically dismantled and replaced with something the Spanish called civilization but which looked, from the inside, remarkably like slavery, and the missions operated according to a peculiar logic that combined religious fervor with brutal pragmatism, the Franciscans genuinely believing they were saving souls while simultaneously creating an economic system that depended entirely on indigenous labor to function, that required indigenous people to plant and harvest wheat, to tend cattle and sheep, to construct buildings, to weave cloth, to produce all the goods that made the missions self-sufficient, and the legal status of mission Indians was carefully calibrated to maximize their exploitability. They were not slaves in the formal sense, could not be bought or sold as individuals, but neither were they free, could not leave the mission without permission, could be hunted down and returned if they fled, could be whipped for infractions of mission discipline, could watch helplessly as their children were raised in a system designed to erase every trace of their indigenous heritage, and the cattle that grazed at San Simeon, descendants of Spanish herds driven up from Mexico, thousands of longhorns spreading across former Salinan hunting grounds, trampled the native grasses that the Salinan had managed for millennia through controlled burning, fundamentally altering the ecology of the region, replacing native bunchgrasses with European annuals that favored different insect populations and supported different wildlife, transforming the very biological composition of the landscape while mission soldiers enforced Spanish control with whips and chains and muskets and the ever-present threat of violence against any indigenous person who resisted conversion or attempted to maintain their traditional lifeways or organized resistance against the mission system, and there were resistances, desperate uprisings quickly crushed, escape attempts into the interior mountains where some Salinan managed to maintain fragments of traditional life beyond Spanish reach, but these were exceptions, brief flares of defiance in a system designed to break indigenous autonomy and reshape indigenous peoples into docile colonial subjects, and by the time Mexican independence arrived in 1821, the damage was already done, the Salinan population decimated by disease and disrupted subsistence patterns, their land alienated and transformed beyond recognition, their culture fragmented into a hybrid existence where younger generations remembered only pieces of the old ways, spoke Spanish as their primary language, worked as laborers in an economy entirely structured by European needs and European concepts of value. Their children raised in a world where being Indian meant being subordinate, where traditional knowledge was derided as superstition, where the only path to survival seemed to be assimilation into the lowest rungs of colonial society. The Spanish had accomplished in a single generation what they set out to do. They had transformed indigenous territory into colonial real estate, creating the legal and physical infrastructure through which that land could be further transferred, further exploited, further removed from any connection to its original inhabitants, and when Mexico secularized the missions in the 1830s, distributing their vast lands to favored Mexican citizens in the form of ranchos, the Salinan people found themselves not liberated but merely transferred from one form of exploitation to another, from mission peonage to rancho labor, still working the same lands their ancestors had hunted and gathered, but now as servants in someone else's cattle empire rather than as free people managing their own resources according to their own needs and desires, and the secularization process itself was chaotic and corrupt. Mission lands, which theoretically belonged to the indigenous peoples who had worked them for decades, being distributed instead to politically connected Californios who had the right family connections, the right military service records, the right relationships with governors and officials, while the indigenous peoples who had actually labored on these lands for generations received nothing, their claims to the land ignored, their decades of forced labor unrewarded, their status as the original inhabitants erased from the legal proceedings that carved California into private ranchos, and this moment, this transition from mission lands to Mexican land grants, represents one of the great thefts in California history, a wholesale transfer of indigenous territory to Mexican elites accomplished through bureaucratic sleight of hand that left indigenous peoples landless in their own homeland, dependent on wage labor for rancheros who now legally owned what had been stolen from their ancestors by the missions and was now being stolen again through secularization. Into this vacuum of secularized mission land stepped José de Jesus Pico, a mixed-race California with African and Spanish ancestry who had served in the Mexican military and who possessed the political connections necessary to secure one of the largest land grants ever issued by a Mexican governor. In 1840, Governor Juan Bautista Alvarado granted Pico the Rancho Piedra Blanca, nearly 49,000 acres of former Mission San Miguel grazing land that encompassed the entire San Simeon coastline, named for the white rocks, Piedras Blancas, that marked the point where the Santa Lucia Mountains plunged into the Pacific, creating a dramatic geological feature visible for miles along the coast, and Pico, who had risked his life fighting against various rebellions and serving the Mexican government in Alta California's chaotic political landscape, where rival factions constantly jockeyed for power and where governors rose and fell with alarming frequency, saw this land grant as his reward, his opportunity to establish himself as a ranchero, a member of the landed gentry in Mexican California's pastoral economy, to create a family estate that would endure for generations, and he understood that land was the foundation of power and status in Mexican California, that being a ranchero meant something more than merely owning property, meant membership in an elite class that dominated California politics and society, that lived according to distinctive cultural patterns of hospitality and horsemanship and elaborate social rituals that distinguished the landed classes from common laborers. But running a rancho of this size required enormous capital and labor, required thousands of head of cattle that needed to be purchased or bred, required vaqueros to tend them and servants to maintain the ranch buildings and cooks to feed the workers and blacksmiths to maintain tools and equipment, required access to markets where hides and tallow, California's primary exports in the decades before the gold rush, the twin commodities that connected this remote territory to global trade networks, could be sold to American and European traders who arrived in ships to anchor in California's primitive harbors and barter manufactured goods for the products of rancho labor, and Pico, despite his military service and political connections, despite the impressive size of his land grant on paper, struggled to transform his paper title into a functioning economic enterprise, struggled to develop the infrastructure necessary to profit from land that was spectacular in its beauty and strategic in its coastal access but remote from the centers of Mexican California's economy, isolated by the rugged Santa Lucia Mountains that made travel to Monterey or Santa Barbara difficult and time-consuming, and by the lack of good harbors that made shipping problematic. San Simeon Bay being little more than an open roadstead exposed to Pacific storms where ships had to anchor offshore and goods had to be shuttled back and forth in small boats through dangerous surf, and while Pico managed to graze cattle across his vast holdings and to build at least one adobe ranch house where he lived with his family, watching the Pacific breakers crash against the rocks below, entertaining occasional visitors who made the difficult journey to this remote outpost, the rancho never achieved the prosperity he had envisioned, never became the economic powerhouse that would secure his family's fortune for generations, never produced the kind of wealth that flowed to rancheros in more accessible locations closer to major trade routes, and Pico found himself increasingly in debt, increasingly struggling to maintain his position, increasingly vulnerable to the economic and political forces that were transforming California even before American conquest. When American filibustering forces invaded California in 1846, beginning the Mexican-American War that would result in California's annexation to the United States, Pico found himself on the losing side of history, a Mexican citizen whose land grant would now have to be validated by American courts, whose property rights would now be subject to American interpretations of Mexican law, whose very presence on land he had considered his own would now be contingent on legal proceedings conducted in a foreign language according to legal principles he didn't fully understand, in courtrooms where American judges and American lawyers operated according to American legal traditions that viewed Mexican land grants with suspicion, as impediments to American settlement, as obstacles to be overcome or invalidated through careful legal argument, and the Land Act of 1851, passed by Congress to adjudicate Mexican land grant claims in newly American California, created a commission process that heavily favored American interests, that required Mexican landholders to prove their titles according to standards that were often impossible to meet, that demanded surveys and documentation that many rancheros had never maintained because the Mexican system had operated on different principles, more informal arrangements based on personal relationships and local knowledge rather than precise legal documents and surveyed boundaries, and the subsequent decades of the 1850s and 1860s saw Pico gradually lose control of his rancho, not through outright dispossession but through the slow erosion of legal fees and drought and economic pressure, through the need to sell parcels to pay lawyers who would defend his title before American land commissions, through the relentless pressure of American squatters and speculators who knew that Mexican land grants could be challenged, boundaries disputed, titles clouded, and ownership transferred through the patient application of American capital and American legal expertise to Mexican confusion and economic vulnerability, and many rancheros, even those who successfully defended their land grants in court, found themselves bankrupted by the legal fees required to do so, forced to sell large portions of their holdings just to pay the lawyers who had saved the rest, and this process, repeated across California, resulted in a massive transfer of land from Mexican to American hands, a legal dispossession that accomplished through courtrooms and lawyers' offices what might otherwise have required military force. The great California droughts of the 1860s delivered the final blow to the ranchero economy. Cattle died by the thousands across California, their carcasses littering the valleys and hillsides, the stench of death hanging over ranchos that had seemed invulnerable just years before. The land itself seemed to turn hostile, year after year without adequate rain, the grasses withering, the springs failing, the entire ecological system that supported the cattle economy collapsing under the weight of extended drought, and rancheros who had lived like feudal lords, who had hosted elaborate fiestas and given away cattle by the dozens to demonstrate their wealth and generosity, suddenly found themselves cash poor and desperate, their wealth tied up in dying livestock and land they couldn't afford to develop, couldn't afford to fence or irrigate or improve with the kinds of agricultural investments that the new American agricultural economy demanded, and into this crisis stepped men like George Hearst, American mining magnates with ready cash and an appetite for land. Men who understood that California's transition from Mexican territory to American state represented an unprecedented opportunity to acquire vast estates at bargain prices from desperate sellers who had no other options, who needed cash immediately to pay debts and legal fees and taxes, who watched their life's work disintegrating and saw selling to Americans as their only escape from complete financial ruin, and in 1865, George Hearst purchased approximately 50,000 acres of the Rancho Piedra Blanca from José de Jesus Pico, paying a price that seemed generous to Pico, who desperately needed the capital, but which represented an infinitesimal fraction of what the land would ultimately be worth, what it would be valued at just decades later when California agriculture boomed and coastal property became increasingly desirable, and Pico, who had received this land as a reward for military service, who had attempted to establish his family as permanent members of California's landed elite, who had invested decades of his life trying to make this remote rancho profitable, now found himself dispossessed. His rancho passed into American hands, his dream of dynastic continuity shattered by forces beyond his control. Drought, war, legal transformation, economic change, the entire structure of Mexican California collapsing around him, and the Rancho Piedra Blanca, which had itself been built on stolen mission lands, which had been carved from indigenous Salinan territory through Spanish conquest and Franciscan conversion, now underwent yet another transformation, another transfer of ownership. Another layer of exploitation built atop previous layers, each successive owner believing their claim more legitimate than the previous one, each convinced they had purchased fairly what had been stolen multiple times over, and José de Jesus Pico disappears from the historical record after the sale, his life and legacy reduced to a few legal documents and land commission testimonies preserved in archives, his adobe ranch house gradually crumbling back into the earth from which it had been built, its walls melting in winter rains, its roof collapsing, its existence forgotten except by local historians and descendants who remember when this was Pico land, before it became Hearst land, before it became monument to American wealth and power. But before George Hearst could fully develop his new acquisition, before he could build his Victorian mansion or establish his cattle operations or construct the infrastructure that would transform raw land into productive ranch, San Simeon underwent yet another metamorphosis, another economic boom built on blood and violence. This time not indigenous blood or Mexican displacement but the industrialized slaughter of Pacific gray whales, and in the years immediately following the American conquest of California, the 1850s and 1860s, San Simeon Point became the site of a shore whaling station, one of dozens established along the California coast by American entrepreneurs who saw whales as nothing more than swimming barrels of oil. Valuable raw materials to be harvested from the ocean and rendered into lamp oil and lubricants that would light American cities and grease American machinery in the decades before petroleum drilling made whale oil obsolete, and the whaling station at San Simeon, established in 1852 by Captain Joseph Clark, a Portuguese immigrant who had changed his name from Machado to sound more American, who had learned whaling in the Azores and brought those skills to California where gray whales migrated close enough to shore to be hunted from small boats launched from the beach, represented a new kind of California exploitation, a new way of extracting value from this landscape, no longer through indigenous labor or cattle ranching but through the systematic pursuit and killing of marine mammals whose only crime was migrating past California's coast on their annual journey between Arctic feeding grounds and Mexican breeding lagoons. The shore whalers operated with brutal efficiency, watchers stationed on high points would scan the ocean for whale spouts, and when a pod was spotted, crews would launch small boats from San Simeon Point, rowing frantically to intercept the whales, harpoons ready, and the hunt itself was a dance of death played out on Pacific swells, boats approaching whales from behind to avoid the powerful flukes that could smash a whaleboat to splinters, harpooners striking, driving iron deep into whale flesh, whales diving and surfacing trailing blood, the water churning red, wounded animals towing boats for miles in their death throes, and sometimes the whales won, smashing boats or dragging them under, drowning crews who disappeared beneath gray water and were never recovered, but more often the whalers won, hauling wounded animals back toward shore where they could be processed, either towing dead whales behind the boats or lashing them alongside and rowing with the weight of several tons of whale carcass slowing every stroke. And the processing was its own kind of horror, whales dragged onto the beach at San Simeon Point, their bodies sliced open with long flensing knives, blubber stripped in long sections like peeling an orange and dumped into rendering pots where it would be boiled down into oil, the tryworks burning constantly during whaling season, the beach running red with blood and littered with whale carcasses in various stages of decomposition, bones piling up, the air thick with the stench of death and rendering blubber, a smell so powerful and pervasive that it marked whaling stations for miles around, and the oil that resulted from this carnage, carefully barreled and shipped to San Francisco and beyond, powered the lamps of American households who never thought about the whales that died to provide their light, who never imagined the brutal industry that stood behind something as simple as illumination. And the whaling station at San Simeon lasted approximately 4 decades, from the early 1850s until the early 1890s, rising and falling with whale populations and market demand and technological changes that made whale oil obsolete, and during its peak years in the 1860s and 1870s, San Simeon became something like a town, a rough settlement of whalers and their families, of the Portuguese and Azorean immigrants who dominated California's shore whaling, bringing their centuries-old techniques and their Catholic festivals and their close-knit community structures to this remote coast, of merchants who supplied the station and profited from the whalers' needs, and in 1852, Captain Clark built a general store and mercantile at the whaling point, a wooden structure that would eventually be moved to its present location and become the famous Sebastian store, and around this nucleus grew hotels and saloons, a school where whalers' children learned their letters, a post office connecting this remote outpost to the broader American postal system, all the infrastructure of American frontier capitalism, all built on the foundation of whale killing, and by 1869, San Simeon had a population of 200 souls, a wharf constructed in that same year to facilitate shipping, to allow larger vessels to load barrels of whale oil without having to anchor in the open roadstead and shuttle goods through the surf, and an economic boom that seemed destined to continue indefinitely, that made fortunes for the station owners and provided steady employment for whaling crews and created business opportunities for merchants and hotel keepers and all the support services that any industrial operation requires. But the whales, unlike the cattle that could be bred and the land that was permanent, were a finite resource, and decades of intensive hunting depleted their numbers, drove them from traditional migration. Routes close to shore forced them to swim farther offshore where shore-based whalers couldn't reach them, and the gray whale population, which had numbered in the tens of thousands before intensive hunting began, crashed to perhaps a few thousand by the 1890s, and by that point there were simply too few whales left to make the enterprise profitable, the crews spending days scanning empty ocean, the trywork sitting cold more often than not, the economic calculus that had made shore whaling viable collapsing as the whales themselves collapsed, and the industry that had seemed permanent, that had created a town and an economy and had employed hundreds of people, disappeared almost overnight, and the town that had grown around the whaling station withered as quickly as it had bloomed, the whalers moving on to other opportunities, some following the declining industry to other locations, others abandoning whaling entirely for California's emerging agricultural economy, the merchants closing their shops, the hotels emptying, the schools shutting down as families departed, and San Simeon Point, which had been the center of economic activity, which had bustled with commerce and industry, became once again a quiet stretch of coast where the bones of whales bleached in the sun and tide pools slowly washed away the residue of industrial killing, and only the warehouse and the store and a few other structures remained as physical evidence that this had once been a site of such concentrated violence and economic activity, and these remnants, these architectural survivals, would eventually be incorporated into George Hearst's ranching operation, would become support facilities for his cattle empire, the wharf used to ship ranch products instead of whale oil, the warehouse storing ranch equipment instead of barrels of rendered blubber, their original purpose forgotten or deliberately obscured as San Simeon transitioned yet again from one economic model to another, from whale killing to cattle ranching to, eventually, the pleasure grounds of America's most famous newspaper magnate, and the environmental damage done by those decades of intensive whaling, the gray whale population driven to the brink of extinction, the ecosystem disrupted by the removal of key apex predators, would take more than a century to even begin to heal, would require complete protection and decades of conservation effort before gray whale populations recovered to anything approaching their pre-whaling numbers, and even today, even with protection, the whales carry in their genes the bottleneck of that near extinction, the genetic diversity lost when populations crashed, the evolutionary potential narrowed by human hunting, and none of this history, none of this environmental destruction, is mentioned in the tours of Hearst Castle, as if the whaling station had never existed, as if this coast had always been pristine wilderness waiting to become someone's private playground. As if beauty had no cost and required no violence to achieve. George Hearst, who purchased the Rancho Piedra Blanca in 1865, was a different breed of California capitalist than either José de Jesus Pico or the shore whalers. He was a mining magnate who had made his fortune in Nevada's Comstock lode, who had risked everything on underground silver deposits and won spectacularly, who understood the capitalist principle of transforming natural resources into cash through the application of labor and technology, who had developed mines from Montana to South Dakota to Mexico, who knew how to organize large-scale industrial operations, how to manage workers, how to think in terms of decades rather than seasons, and who saw in his San Simeon acquisition not merely a ranch but a dynastic seat, a place where his family could establish roots in California soil, could become permanent fixtures of the state's emerging aristocracy, could build something that would outlast the boom-and-bust cycles of mining, could create generational wealth based on land, rather than on the precarious foundations of underground minerals that eventually played out, and unlike the whalers who extracted value and moved on, unlike Pico who struggled to maintain his holdings, Hearst had the capital and the long-term vision to develop the land properly, to invest in infrastructure that would pay dividends across generations, to think not just about immediate profit but about building an estate that would establish the Hearst name as one of California's founding families, and in the 1870s, as the whaling industry began its terminal decline, Hearst built the physical plant that would define San Simeon for the next 50 years, built it not on Camp Hill where his son would later erect the castle but down near the coast, near the working harbor, where a ranch needed to be for practical operations, where cattle could be loaded onto ships and supplies could be received and where the business of running a 50,000-acre cattle empire could be efficiently managed. In 1878, George Hearst constructed a 1,000-foot wharf at San Simeon Bay to facilitate the shipping of cattle and agricultural products, built a large warehouse at the wharf's base to store goods awaiting transport, and most significantly, built an 18-room Victorian ranch house in the Italianate style popular among California's nouveau riche, with its characteristic square tower and low-pitched roof and decorative brackets and tall narrow windows, a proper estate home that signaled the Hearsts' arrival as members of California's landed gentry, that announced their status and taste and permanence, and this Victorian mansion, still standing today, still owned by the Hearst family, still used as a private residence and therefore invisible to the tourists who flock to the castle, still occupied by Hearst descendants who maintain it as their primary connection to San Simeon, preferring its human scale and coastal location to the overwhelming grandeur of the castle on the hill, represented the first Hearst architectural statement in San Simeon, the first attempt to impose refined taste and Eastern sophistication on raw California landscape, and the house itself, with its tall windows looking out over the Pacific and its ornate woodwork crafted by skilled carpenters brought from San Francisco and its fashionable architectural details copied from pattern books that circulated among America's aspiring upper classes, must have seemed wildly out of place in this remote coastal location, a piece of San Francisco or Sacramento society transplanted to windswept ranchland where cattle outnumbered people 100 to 1, but that was precisely the point. That was how California's new elite announced themselves, by building structures that proclaimed their distance from frontier crudeness, their belonging to national rather than merely regional culture, their status as Americans who happened to live in California rather than as Californians who were slowly becoming American. And Phoebe Hearst, George's wife, a woman of considerable education and refinement who had been a schoolteacher before her marriage and who maintained cultural interests far beyond her husband's business obsessions, visited this Victorian ranch house and helped furnish it with the kinds of tasteful appointments that a woman of her class and education would consider appropriate, with proper furniture ordered from San Francisco merchants, with books and musical instruments and all the accoutrements of cultured Victorian domesticity, attempting to create an oasis of civilization in what must have seemed to her like wilderness, and the Hearsts used San Simeon not as a primary residence but as a retreat, a place to escape San Francisco society during certain seasons, a working ranch that also functioned as a pleasure ground, and George Hearst developed the land systematically. He introduced scientific ranch management techniques learned from agricultural journals and consultation with experts, imported improved cattle breeds to upgrade his herds, planted extensive fruit orchards that would eventually cover hundreds of acres, built reservoirs and water systems to make the land more productive, employed dozens of ranch hands and vaqueros who lived in bunkhouses scattered across the property and worked under foremen who answered to ranch managers who answered to Hearst himself, creating a hierarchy of labor and management that mirrored the mining operations that had made his fortune, and the ranch became profitable, became self-sustaining, became the foundation of a California estate that would eventually encompass 250,000 acres, stretching from the coast deep into the interior valleys, one of the largest private landholdings in California, and George Hearst, who had arrived in California as a prospector with nothing but ambition and luck, who had walked away from a failing Missouri farm to try his fortune in the gold fields, who had nearly starved in his early years in California, had successfully transformed himself into a California land baron, a United States senator, a patriarch of one of the state's great families, and when he died in 1891, he left to his widow Phoebe an estate worth $18 million, including the San Simeon ranch, and Phoebe, who shared her husband's ambition if not his rough manners, who had accompanied him from poverty to wealth and who had her own ideas about what that wealth should accomplish, continued to develop the property, continued to use it as a family retreat, and brought her son William Randolph on camping trips to a place they called Camp Hill, high in the mountains above the Victorian ranch house, where the family would stay in elaborate platform tents with wooden floors and proper beds and china and silverware and all the accoutrements of civilized camping, where they could look out across the coastline and the inland valleys and see, spread before them, land that belonged to them as far as the eye could reach, and young William Randolph, camping on that hilltop with his mother, watching the sun set over the Pacific while servants prepared meals and attended to every need, absorbed the lesson that his parents intended, that land meant power, that ownership meant permanence, that beauty could be possessed and shaped and remade according to personal vision, that California was a place where someone with enough money and ambition could build their own reality, could transform wilderness into paradise through the application of capital and will. And decades later, when William Randolph inherited this land upon his mother's death in 1919, when he was already one of the most powerful newspaper publishers in America, when he had built an empire of yellow journalism and political influence, he would put those lessons into practice on a scale that even his ambitious parents could never have imagined, would transform Camp Hill from a camping destination into a palace that would astonish the world. But to understand what William Randolph Hearst built on Camp Hill between 1919 and 1947, to comprehend the true meaning of Hearst Castle rising white and impossible against California sky, requires understanding everything that came before, requires recognizing that the Enchanted Hill was never empty, that every stone of Casa Grande rests on accumulated layers of displacement and exploitation, that the castle was not built on virgin land but on a palimpsest written and rewritten by successive waves of occupation, Salinan hunters who knew every spring and deer trail, Franciscan missionaries who conscripted indigenous labor and built an empire of souls, Mexican rancheros who grazed cattle across stolen mission lands, American miners who bought empires for pittances, Portuguese whalers who turned ocean red with blood, Victorian cattle barons who built the first mansions, each group remaking the landscape according to their needs and desires, each group erasing or obscuring the evidence of previous occupation, each group believing that their claim was legitimate, their ownership permanent, their vision of what this land could be the final and correct one, and what Hearst did, beginning in 1919, was simply continue this pattern on a grander scale, was take the accumulated capital of generations of extraction and exploitation, gold mines and silver mines and copper mines, newspaper empires and political influence, cattle ranches and wheat fields and urban real estate, every kind of American wealth accumulation concentrated into one family's fortune, and pour it all into creating something that had never existed before, a palace on a California hilltop that rivaled anything in Europe, that announced to the world that America had arrived, that American wealth could match old world grandeur, that the new aristocracy of industrial capitalism could build monuments as permanent as any medieval castle, but the foundation upon which this monument rested was not bedrock but history, was not solid ground but layers of contested ownership, was not empty wilderness but land that had been inhabited and fought over and transferred and transformed for 10,000 years before the first stone of Hearst Castle was ever laid, and this history, the real history, the uncomfortable history, the history that complicates the fairy tale of self-made success and entrepreneurial vision, was systematically obscured as construction progressed, was buried beneath tons of imported European antiquities and carefully landscaped gardens and architect Julia Morgan's brilliant designs, was forgotten by everyone except the descendants of those who had been displaced, the Salinan people who still lived in the region, who still remembered when their ancestors hunted these hills, who watched from a distance as yet another wealthy invader transformed their homeland into yet another monument to someone else's vision of paradise, and the Victorian ranch house that George Hearst had built in 1878, the structure that had been San Simeon's first mansion, the building that had announced the Hearsts' arrival as California land barons, was now overshadowed, made obsolete, rendered invisible by the far grander structure rising on Camp Hill, and the whaling station that had once been San Simeon's economic center was reduced to tourist curiosity, the old warehouse serving purposes far removed from its original function, the Sebastian store selling souvenirs to visitors who knew nothing about whale blood and rendering pots, and the wharf becoming a recreational fishing pier where tourists cast lines into water where whales once died by the hundreds, all memory of blood and blubber and industrial killing carefully scrubbed away, sanitized into charming historical footnotes that added local color without disturbing anyone's enjoyment, and the Rancho Piedra Blanca that José de Jesus Pico had received as a land grant, that he had struggled to develop, that he had lost to American capital and American legal systems, was now simply the Hearst Ranch, its Mexican origins forgotten or reduced to historical trivia, its connection to mission lands erased from popular memory, its indigenous prehistory ignored entirely, and Mission San Miguel Arcangel, which had claimed this land as grazing territory for converted Indians, was now a restored monument where tourists came to admire the architecture and the painted murals without fully understanding the system of coerced labor and cultural destruction that the mission represented, where guides spoke about the Padres' civilizing mission without mentioning the thousands who died of disease or the cultural genocide that mission system embodied, and the Salinan people themselves, whose ancestors had inhabited this land for 10 millennia, who had known every spring and canyon and coastal ledge, who had managed these hills with fire and seasonal burning and intimate ecological knowledge, who had lived here long before missions or ranchos or castles, were now confined to small rancherias elsewhere, their territorial claims never recognized by any of the successive governments that had controlled California, their culture preserved only in fragments collected by anthropologists and stored in museum archives, their connection to San Simeon severed by successive waves of conquest and colonization that had transformed their homeland into someone else's property, and all of this history, indigenous, Spanish, Mexican, American, every layer of occupation and displacement, was compressed into the foundation of Hearst Castle, literally and metaphorically, the weight of centuries bearing down on the bedrock of Camp Hill, invisible to the tourists who came to gawk at indoor swimming pools and Spanish Renaissance ceilings and priceless art collections, but present nonetheless, present in the very stones of the castle, in the labor that built it, in the capital that financed it, in the legal structures that protected it, in the stories that were told about it and the stories that were deliberately not told, and this is what the tour guides don't mention when they lead groups through the rooms where movie stars once partied and newspaper magnates once plotted. That Hearst Castle is not merely a building but a monument to a particular way of understanding California history, a way that emphasizes individual achievement over collective dispossession, that celebrates wealth creation without interrogating wealth extraction, that treats land as commodity rather than as home, that sees beauty in imported European antiquities while ignoring the indigenous art and architecture that existed here first. And the castle stands today not as the beginning of San Simeon's story but as a late chapter in a much longer narrative, not as the fulfillment of California's promise but as evidence of whose promises got fulfilled and whose got broken, whose dreams came true and whose were systematically destroyed, and when you visit Hearst Castle today and marvel at its grandeur, remember that you are standing on ground that has been inhabited, contested, stolen, sold, and transformed for 10,000 years. That beneath your feet lie the shell middens of Salinan campsites and the foundations of Spanish mission outposts and the forgotten adobes of Mexican rancheros and the rendering pots of American whalers and the Victorian mansion of the mining magnate who made it all possible, and that every stone you see, every garden you walk through, every magnificent room you enter, is built not on virgin wilderness but on accumulated history. Not on empty land but on the displacement of peoples and the erasure of cultures and the relentless forward march of a particular vision of civilization that required, at every stage, that something else be destroyed, something else be forgotten, something else be buried beneath the weight of what came next, and if you listen carefully, if you step away from the tour group and find a quiet corner where the Pacific wind still blows as it has for millennia, you might hear echoes of all those earlier San Simeons, might sense the presence of those who came before, might understand that the castle's grandeur rests on foundations far more complex and far more troubling than the official history admits, and might recognize that the real twin estates of San Simeon were never castles at all but parallel systems of power and dispossession, the mission and the rancho, the Mexican grant and the American purchase, the whaling station and the cattle empire, each one enabling the next, each one preparing the ground for what would follow, each one contributing to the accumulated weight of history that William Randolph Hearst inherited when his mother died in 1919 and that he transformed, with architect Julia Morgan's genius and millions of dollars and decades of obsessive building, into the white palace that now dominates the hilltop, the monument that now defines San Simeon, the castle that now obscures everything that came before, and this is the secret story, the hidden history, the truth that sits uncomfortably beneath the surface of California's favorite fairy tale. That paradise was built on someone else's land, that beauty required ugliness, that creation demanded destruction, that every magnificent thing you see at Hearst Castle exists because something else ceased to exist, and the only question left is whether we have the courage to remember what was lost, to acknowledge what was taken, to tell the full story rather than just the parts that flatter our sense of historical inevitability and American exceptionalism, because until we do, until we understand that San Simeon's story is not about one man's genius or one family's ambition but about centuries of displacement and exploitation and the systematic erasure of inconvenient truths, we will never truly see Hearst Castle for what it is, not the beginning of the story but the latest chapter, not virgin creation but palimpsest, not innocent beauty but beauty built on bones, and the wind that blows through those white corridors and across those manicured lawns carries with it the whispers of all those who came before, all those whose stories were buried to make room for the castle's grandeur, and if we listen, if we truly listen, we might finally understand that the real history of San Simeon is not about what was built but about what was destroyed to make that building possible, and that understanding, uncomfortable as it may be, is the only honest way to approach this place, this monument, this testament to what America was and is and perhaps always will be, a place where dreams are built on other people's nightmares, where beauty rises from ugliness, where the present systematically erases the past, and where magnificent architecture serves, whether intentionally or not, as a tombstone marking the burial of everything that came before.